Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. My guest today, Seth Schindler, is a senior lecturer in urban development and transformation at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. He studies large-scale infrastructure projects like the building of ports and roads and railways, and he predicts that geopolitical rivalry between China and the United States will be the key factor driving the development of these massive projects. In fact, as he explains, we are on the cusp of an infrastructure building arms race between the United States and China. In our conversation, we talked through the implications of this trend, which has accelerated since China launched a massive global infrastructure building strategy known as the Belt and Road Initiative. And it was in response to the Belt and Road Initiative that the U.S. Congress passed a law this October known as the U.S. Build Act, which established a new International Development Finance Corporation known as the IDFC. We kick off our conversation discussing both the Belt and Road Initiative and this new U.S. International Development Finance Corporation before having a broader discussion about the ways in which this rivalry will manifest itself around the world and its impact on global development. This episode is part of a content partnership between the podcast and the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. Experts from the Global Development Institute come on the show to discuss their research and also the pressing news of the day as it relates to global inequalities and development. If you'd like to learn more about the Global Development Institute, you can go to gdi.manchester.ac.uk or click on the ad on globaldispatchespodcast.com. And now here is my conversation with Professor Seth Schindler.
Well, the Belt and Road Initiative was launched or announced in 2013 by the current Chinese Premier Xi Jinping, and it's a more or less a strategy rather than a single initiative. So it's a series of projects really that signals kind of China's determination or commitment to reach out beyond its borders and establish firm linkages with countries in Eurasia and Africa. And I would say that it's geared toward establishing a sphere of influence, although it's a peaceful initiative, of course, but there is an underlying objective of establishing influence in these places by transforming territory and orienting it toward China. So you'll see.
What's a good example of that?
Well, a lot of port building, for example, and it's not just one port that's being built, but a number of ports are being purchased. Some are being built. They're greenfield developments, meaning there was no port there before. And so it's this logistics infrastructure that integrates coastal areas, connects them typically via Chinese-built railways and roads into interiors, so into resource frontiers or areas with where there's agribusiness taking place. And so commodities, that is resources and agribusiness commodities, are being then channeled toward China. And this territory that's being produced, these spheres of influence then, I would say, that are being produced are then being integrated into China's kind of greater sphere of influence or, Sinocentric global production networks. So these are global production networks, but they're anchored in China. And until recently, everyone kind of assumed that global production networks would have lead firms in Europe or North America, and that's increasingly not the case. We see a lot of large Chinese firms and Asian firms growing. Of course, Japanese firms have always managed production in some parts of the world. But what we're really seeing, I think, with BRI is a fundamental eastward orientation of some places in the world toward China as they're integrated then with Chinese production networks.
So one of the more ambitious projects envisioned under the Belt Road Initiative is the Lamu Port South Sudan Ethiopia Transit Corridor. Can you just sort of situate that geographically for people who are unfamiliar, and then talk about what this massive project entails?
Yeah, sure. So this is a transnational region that, as the name suggests, extends from it includes parts of northern Kenya, then cuts across South Sudan and southern Ethiopia, and integrates then Lamu Port, which is in northeast Kenya, with the resource frontier in South Sudan, western Kenya, and southern Ethiopia. It's important to note that this initiative had been planned ages ago. I mean, the first time that this infrastructure network was dreamed of, I think, was in the 1970s, but it never went anywhere. And this area was sort of thought of as a kind of frontier, sometimes a lawless frontier. It was a place where the Kenyan government, for example, struggled to establish control in the British colonial era. Just north of Isiolo, there's a town called Archer's Post, which was the final frontier, so to speak, of the British colonial empire, the final outpost before you really got beyond British colonial control. So this initiative is it's more or less been incorporated into Belt and Road, I would say. I mean, it was dreamed of before, it was conceptualized, then it was part of the infrastructure was built. And what we see is that a lot of the construction is being done by Chinese firms. So a road now connects Addis Ababa to Nairobi. And then in each of those cities, you can get on a Chinese-built train and go from Addis to Djibouti or from Nairobi to Mombasa. So it's really it's really that Chinese firms and Chinese capital are driving the integration of this area that was previously more or less disconnected and from global production networks and the global economy.
And of course, that is just one example of many projects that are underway under the rubric of the Belt and Road Initiative. But interestingly, it seems now that the United States kind of wants to get into the infrastructure development game, something that, as you noted, China has dominated for many, many years now. Can you talk a little bit about the International Development Finance Corporation? This is a brand new U.S. entity that was had wide bipartisan support, surprisingly, and passed the Senate, passed the House in October. I think it was amid the Kavanaugh hearing, so it didn't get too much attention, but it was passed and then signed into law by President Trump. And so now we have this new International Development Finance Corporation that was created ostensibly to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative. So can you talk a bit about what that new entity entails and how its crafters believe it will compete with the BRI?
Yeah, sure. It's a fascinating story, actually, because for years the U.S. the U.S. federal government was not involved in the construction of infrastructure in developing countries. So U.S. development aid has tended in recent years to focus more on human development, maybe small-scale ventures, business development, but not on
global health stuff, right? Like PEPFAR and the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Those were the big U.S. development projects.
Indeed, and large-scale infrastructure initiatives are notably absent. And so I think alarm bells started ringing in Washington. You'll read all sorts of stuff like Francis Fukuyama and colleagues wrote about Beijing's building boom, and they warned that Beijing was establishing a monopoly in this area and so on. And so we see that thinking kind of taking hold in Washington, and this bill did have bipartisan support. So it was the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation was part of originally the Better Utilization of Investment Leading to Development Act, which so the BUILD Act.
The BUILD Act, yes.
Yeah, exactly. And this act passed through the House with bipartisan support. And then it was in the Foreign Relations Committee, I believe, in the Senate, where it was passed, and it was sitting in the Senate when it suddenly got tacked on to the Federal Aviation Authorization Act. So
a classic
it was passed,
maneuver
it
in
really
the
was.
Senate,
And there are some pretty other funny things that were tacked onto that bill, something about sports medicine, doctors, insurance, and so on. But the important thing to note, I think, is that that obviously Washington has bipartisan cooperation is in short supply in Washington. So I think a number of initiatives that did have bipartisan support were just put together and passed through the Senate and then signed by the president. And what the Build Act did is create the International Development Finance Corporation, which will have about $60 billion at its disposal to fund large-scale infrastructure projects. And the bill, it's quite fascinating because it's explicitly, it doesn't mention China, but it does say that it's meant to provide low and middle-income countries aligned with the U.S. with a non-authoritarian alternative. So you
hint,
can
nudge, nudge, right?
Indeed. But what's quite interesting is that it only allows the IDFC to fund up to about a third of any single project. So the remaining 2/3 of the capital investment will have to come from somewhere else, probably the private sector. So whoever crafted that assumes that this bill will actually generate $180 billion in investment. That's the objective anyway.
And so if you're, a country, a middle income country, generally aligned with the US, but, also not at all hostile to China, how would you decide where to go for your financing? I mean, one of the big knocks on the BRI has been that it is really like a debt trap, or has become a debt trap to many countries. I know Sri Lanka, for example, is a good example of how a port project that started out very ambitious ended up with the Chinese owning the lease to this port for the next century because Sri Lanka, became so indebted to China that was constructing this port. I guess can you describe that example and also discuss what's going through a country's mind when it decides to where to go for its funding?
Well, there are a couple of things to unpack there. I mean, first, this notion of the BRI as a debt trap. I think it's important to note that there are at the moment, I don't know how many countries are considered part of the BRI. It's rather acephalous. Many countries have joined just last week. Xi Jinping was in Argentina. Portugal has signaled its enthusiasm. So there are far more countries involved than there are countries that have fallen into some sort of debt trap. I mean, I think that that could happen with almost any lender, I would say. So a small number of countries, perhaps, that have borrowed money from China in the context of BRI are highly indebted. Sri Lanka is indeed one of them. And I think the lesson learned from Sri Lanka is that in many ways, perhaps the Chinese lenders were a bit too accommodating to the government that was in power, and you might say the same about projects that were approved in Malaysia before the recent change in the government there. I think what we're going to see is that Chinese lenders are going to be a lot more careful about how much money they provide for a project. So they're not simply going to rubber stamp loans anymore, which I have a feeling that's kind of what they were doing. Because keep in mind, the lending is indeed, it does have a political logic. It's not just an economic logic. So they were happy to accommodate allies, basically. And when allies asked for funding, they were happy to accommodate, and then suddenly they'd ask for more funding, and the price of some of these projects ballooned, and so much so that they didn't reflect any longer the actual cost of building the infrastructure, and the where that money went is a mystery. But I guess we can take a pretty good guess. What we see now from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is headquartered in Beijing, is a kind of new or an emergent commitment to preventing corruption. So I think we're going to see projects, the loans reflect the cost of the projects in the future.
Well, I mean, more broadly, so you have the advent of this new International Development Finance Corporation on the one hand. On the other hand, you have China's longstanding investments that have been increased under the BRI rubric. How do you expect these to compare competing sort of
Yeah.
visions, these two competing entities, to interact with each other and to affect sort of the geopolitics of
Yeah.
broader Chinese-U.S. competition?
Great question. So, I mean, on the one hand, you would immediately think that it's positive from the perspective of developing countries that are in the market for large-scale infrastructure, because the more lenders, obviously, the more competition there is among lenders, the cheaper the capital. You would think that might not necessarily be the case for a couple of reasons. First, the United States, 16 senators sent a letter to the U.S. Secretary of State and Secretary of the Treasury urging them to vote against countries in the IMF if they apply for a loan, if they're indebted to China for infrastructure projects.
Well, because you wouldn't want like U.S. money paid into the IMF to pay off Chinese loans to those countries that are indebted to. Oh man, I mean, the logic makes a lot of sense. Like, why would U.S. taxpayers have to fund, I don't know, Sri Lanka's debt to China over an IMF loan?
Indeed, and that's certainly the logic. But what it does do is basically say that if you borrow from China, you're on your own if you get in trouble, or at least you can't come to the lender of last resort, the IMF. And so I think instead of competing with China, we'll start to see the U.S. Trying to contain China. And infrastructure development is just one field in which that's taking place. There are all sorts of other ways that I'm sure the listeners are aware of where the U.S. and China are competing: trade, for example, intellectual property rights, regulations, and so on. I think this is just another one of those fields, and so the U.S. is going to try
strategy of containment. This is a Cold War sort of terminology that you're using now, but in the infrastructure space. That's really interesting.
Indeed, and it's a literal strategy of containment because, again, a lot of these it's about the production of territory, the Belt and Road. So there's an underlying logistics network that's kind of establishing territory to be plugged into Sinocentric production networks, and that is then a sphere of influence. So whoever connects the world, so to speak, kind of controls it or can exert influence. And we see the Europeans playing the same game. In September, the EU Asia Connectivity Initiative was passed, and the Europeans were much more careful about how they talked about the Belt and Road Initiative, and they explicitly stated in press conferences, EU officials, that it was not meant to compete with the BRI. But I think we do see a race to connect the world among global superpowers, and primarily, it's the U.S. and China that we'll see playing this game. But you see other powers, particularly regional powers, that do play locally. So Brazil, Japan plays in some places, and so rather than a kind of great game, so to speak, to connect Eurasia, we're seeing a great race, you might say, to a great game. Sorry, to control Eurasia. You'll see a great race to connect it.
So, on the one hand, it seems that you have all this money now flowing in from both the United States and China to these great infrastructure and connectivity projects. And so one might sort of be tempted to think that that is a boon in general for global development. But on the other hand, what you're telling me is that these projects are being driven not with global development in mind, but with the sort of geopolitical interests of both the Chinese and the Americans driving the agenda. So I guess my question is, what are the implications for global development for these projects, for countries and local actors and the ostensible recipients of this kind of aid and development assistance?
Well, it really depends on the country. And I think what we're going to see is that countries develop increasingly sophisticated strategies to kind of balance their relationship, particularly countries that are aligned with both the US and China and would like to remain so. They will develop strategies to kind of play both sides in a way. But this is
so can you give me an example actually of how that might look?
Yeah, so there are a couple of examples, but I think Tanzania is a great example. So it's a strong U.S. ally in East Africa, but it has a long history of cooperation with China. China built the Tazara Railway, which linked the Zambian copper belt to Dar es Salaam, and it was one of China's first overseas development infrastructure development projects in the 60s. Interestingly, that's where the strategy of non-interference comes from, because it was right after the colonial period. So China could hardly turn up in Dar es Salaam and tell the Tanzanians how to run their country. So it was very much an anti-colonial policy, this China's strategy of non-interference. In any case, we see Tanzania does suffer from an infrastructure deficit, and in the 2010 Integrated Industrial Development Strategy, Tanzania's industrial policy embraced spatial planning. So out of something like the first, development of development corridors, a regional division of labor, a new port project, integrating kind of the western part of the country with the eastern part. So all of these kinds of spatial development strategies that we saw in the 1970s were resurrected. And that's not only Tanzania, that's a global phenomenon that happened after 2009. We can talk about why in a moment. The point is simply that in Tanzania's industrial policy in 2010, there were 7 key points, recommendations. The first 5 were spatial. Now, spatial planning is expensive, particularly intercity infrastructure. It's not kind of, perhaps in the past when you thought of infrastructure, you think of citywide systems like investment in water or electricity, and those are still needed and they still take place. But increasingly what we're seeing with initiatives like the BRI, it's expensive intercity connectivity, so rail networks, road networks, regional power grids, etc., and a lot of times transnational investments as well. So they're quite complicated. Now, Tanzania requires this infrastructure for its development plan, or at least its planners think that it does, and they're quite expensive. So I think it certainly didn't hurt when China showed up and was willing to pay for a $10 billion port in Bagamoyo. It's a small town north of Dar es Salaam. This was a project that no other funders were interested in, and yet China was willing to build Africa's largest port in Tanzania. So I think that really sent a message to the rest of the world, and it is a game changer when you have a new lender that's willing to take a risk and take risks that other lenders are not. And the reason why other lenders were not was, again, because at that time the US wasn't in the infrastructure development game, you could say. It was private sector lenders. And some of these projects are just too risky for northern banks whose shareholders will demand that they don't take such risks. So surely developing intercity networked infrastructure across national borders, say from Addis Ababa to Djibouti, is a very risky endeavor and expensive that a single private bank would really hesitate to undertake. So you really need a large state that's willing to assume some of that risk and is perhaps in it for some political reward as well.
Can you talk about, I guess, the sort of the logic of infrastructure-led development as opposed to the Washington Consensus, which is this idea that you could privatize and sort of develop more neoliberal economies?
Yeah, sure. So I think first it's important to remember that in the 1970s, there was a consensus among planners in the USSR and the USA with regard to the effectiveness of large-scale infrastructure-led development in developing countries. So, the USSR and the US, they were in competition for client states. But once their planners got to these places, they more or less did the same thing. There were only minor differences between the planning regimes of US engineers and planners and the Soviets. All of that comes to an end in the 1980s for a number of reasons, but most importantly, interest rates in the U.S. go up to about 20%, and there's a debt crisis in much of the so-called third world. So for countries that had loans, or that had taken loans and borrowed to build infrastructure, they simply couldn't continue paying those. Other countries that had planned large-scale infrastructure projects were unable to see them through. And we had from the early 1980s for about 2 decades, the Washington Consensus and the institutions that supported the Washington Consensus discouraged states from borrowing to construct infrastructure. If we think of the 10 points of the Washington Consensus, it's completely aspatial. So the imperative is to get the prices right. But what we saw was that the private sector did not actually develop those large-scale connective infrastructure projects that we see now, and particularly transnational ones. So then we went into this period of good governance, and the imperative was then to get the institutions right. And that also didn't really do anything with regard to infrastructure development. So what we see now, and this is particularly because of the 2008 crisis, is this imperative to get the territory right. So Paul Krugman's work on the new economic geography, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2008, and this kind of signaled to economists that it was okay to start thinking spatially again and to reincorporate space into neoclassical economics. And at the World Bank, after Joe Stiglitz left, we saw Justin Lin take over as the chief economist. He was the first non-Western chief economist, and he's from China, by the way. So he has, of course, a very different understanding of the relationship between the economy and the state. And he kind of put some of those ideas into high-level policy. And we saw the 2009 World Development Report released by the World Bank, which stated that it's okay for states to do spatial planning in some circumstances. In other words, states can build infrastructure. They can determine kind of where things take place, the economic geography within their country under certain circumstances. And so that really just opened the door for the return of all of these types of state-led planning and infrastructure development schemes. And we've seen then the resurrection of a host of regional planning strategies, such as development corridors, new town planning, dams are back on the agenda. And China was really at the forefront of that. But it's important to note that the Belt and Road Initiative is consistent with that logic. But it's only the most ambitious of those plans. We see many others. LAPSET, as you mentioned, is not technically part of BRI, but you also have the Greater Mekong Subregion, the COSI Plan in Latin America. And so the Belt and Road Initiative is only the most ambitious of that type of thinking and that type of plan.
So maybe like taking a step back, if you are interested, say your goal, your priority is the sort of alleviation of poverty, is economic development in countries with low GDPs, just basically the uplifting of people from poor situations. Are you on balance supportive of this kind of growing competition between the US and China, or do you think it will detract from those broader global development goals?
That's a very difficult question, and I think it's you can't simply give one answer. So what we're going to see is that some countries with responsive governments, with governments that have that are responsible either to an electorate or a true developmental mission, they will make use of the BRI funding that's available or from the IDFC, and they will plan projects accordingly. I think we'll see that in both instances. There's just so much money available that you will find some bureaucrats or some governments tempted, and you'll see they're just using it for. You'll find instances of corruption in some cases, but you will also find places that there are real infrastructure deficits that governments will be able to address. These are long-standing deficits. From the 1980s until the mid-2000s, governments were discouraged by the Washington Consensus from investing in infrastructure. And so we have real infrastructure deficits in places, and it's not a bad thing if you say connect places that have historically been disconnected from the global economy with roads, with rail, with energy infrastructure, and so on. So I think you just can't simply say that this will be necessarily a good thing or necessarily a bad thing, but you will see certain governments coupling, you could say, a kind of strategic coupling with the Belt and Road Initiative or with the IDFC in very different ways. And some of them will be able to leverage it for positive development impacts.
Well, Seth, thank you so much for your time. This was interesting and helpful, and just I think a fascinating take on a kind of this new pseudo Cold War dynamic taking place in around the world.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Dr. Schindler, Seth, and all the good folks at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester for entering into this fantastic content partnership with the podcast. I've been very pleased with the kind of content that we've been able to create through this partnership. And I must say, this conversation actually adds a very textured layer to ongoing rivalries between the United States and China over trade and national security and other issues. This, I think, should lead a sense of depth to your own understanding of an emergent rivalry and perhaps an emergent Cold War between the U.S. and China. All right, well, see you next time. Thanks. Bye.